Well, what a wonderful privilege it is this morning to be worshiping together. God's given us the gift of music to declare truths and also His unshakable, unchanging Word. And so it is an act of worship as well. I don't think we should just think of the music as the worship, but also an act of worship when God's people turn and put ourselves under the authority of what He says and then encourage one another to obey it. So we're in a series here on the Psalms. You've been in it for some weeks, and you know that the Psalms are hymns of the ancient Israelites. They're worship songs. And the Psalms span all different aspects of human life. And that's why the lens through which we're studying them, that they give us the words to speak back to God. We know God speaks, and we sometimes say, well, how are we to approach God with the various difficulties and challenges and indeed the positive things of life? And the Psalms give us those words that span all of the human horizon. And today we come to Psalm number 90. Now, Psalm 90 is unusual for a couple of reasons. One already mentioned by Joel, that if you have a physical Bible, you'll notice that right after it says the Psalm number, it says a prayer of Moses. And this is strange because you know you've been in the Psalms sometimes. Many of them are written by King David. And some of them are unnamed, but there's only one written by Moses, and it's Psalm 90. Now, you think about the relationship between Moses and David, that is in chronology. We think both lived a long time ago. We say David lived about the year 1000 BC. Moses, we don't know exactly, but Moses probably lived around 1400 BC. So that's a big time span. So if you will, the distance of time, the length of time between David and Moses is about the length of time between those of us in this room and somebody like William Shakespeare. The point is, this is a very old psalm. Of all the psalms that have an author, this one is by far the oldest. Now, not only is it unique because Moses is the only one written by Moses, but we have to think about Moses' own biography, as Joel hinted at a few moments ago. You think, what did Moses experience in his life? He was in Egypt. The Israelites are this small band of slaves. God miraculously delivers them, what we call the 10 plagues, right? Really 10 judgments upon the Egyptians. And Moses is the leader of the Israelites out of Egypt, and they spend 40 years wandering in the desert. And what are the Israelites doing in the desert over those 40 years? Say they're doing things against God's will, aren't they? That they're building idols, that they're grumbling all the time, that God says, this is what I want my people to do. And it seems every opportunity that the Israelites had, they did the opposite of what God wanted to do. And so they're wanderers. They're just in the desert roaming, frustrated, disobeying God. And I think you'll see in a moment why this psalm makes a lot of sense coming out of that context, that they're not at home, they're wandering, and they're noticing who God is and who they are. So as we read it in a moment, I want you to think about how this psalm works. I think it's best understood as a contrast. You know the saying, contrast is the mother of clarity. I've always taken that to heart. So you want to know what something is, you can explain what it's not. And Psalm 90 has a very stark contrast between what it means to be a human being on a fallen earth, in a fallen condition, and what it means to be God. And this psalm's going to confront some things, as Josiah just prayed, some things about being human that we don't like to think about. And I think you'd agree with me that one of the reason we really hold the Bible as God's word, yes, but I think more important, it doesn't just tell us what we want to hear, but the Bible tells us what we need to hear, and deep down what we know is true. And as much as our culture says you don't want to face these things, or don't, if you pretend that they're not there, they won't be there, say that's not true. We all know that. And Psalm 90 says this is what it means to be a human being, and this is who God is. Therefore, there's a choice to be made as to how we're to live today. So listen for the contrast, and then we'll spend two sections, one on what it means to be human, then the person of God. So Moses wrote, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth of the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You return man to dust and say, return, O children of man. For 1,000 years is in your sight are as but yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. You sweep them away as with a flood. They are like a dream. like a grass that is renewed in the morning, and in the morning it flourishes and is renewed, but in the evening it fades and it withers. For you are brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all of our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength, 80. Yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone and fly away. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? So teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord. How long? Have pity on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all of our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord, our God, be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. So you see there, I hope you saw, that there's some things said in there about what it means to be a human, and then gloriously the things about what it means to be God. And we'll look at those in turn. We start with the bad news, the sad part, but true part, and that is the transience of human beings. You know, as Charles Haddon Spurgeon, the great 19th century preacher called the Prince of Preachers, in his commentary on this psalm, he summarized it. He said, "We human beings are troubled, transitory, and sinful. That our days are marked by challenges and disappointments, that we're all just passing through, and by the way, we always seem to do the wrong thing when given the opportunity to do so." And so we look and we see all kinds of words, and they're scary words, right? That we wither, that we're swept away in a sigh. And all these point to the reality that human beings, that we're very weak. And again, our culture wants to tell us, well, just don't think about that, you know, and focus on how good we are and that we're quite clever and that we have good medicine and so forth. We don't want to think about the truth is that all of us are withering and fading away, that we're frail. So you see there, I've got the phrase there that all human beings are the endangered species. You think many environmental issues these days, and you can read, we've all seen the things on the list about what it means to be an endangered species. Some of them become extinct, some of them come back. But the truth is, what Psalm 90 is saying, that the real endangered species are human beings. That all of us are going to meet our end. Look at what Watts, the famous hymn writer, says. This is from the hymn, "O God, our help in ages past." He says, "Time, like an ever-rolling stream, bears all its sons away. They fly forgotten as a dream dies at the opening day." So this is quite a line of poetry, isn't it? Time marches on. Our lives will all be swallowed up. You know, whether you're speaking or writing, they say be very cautious using superlatives. You want to be very careful when you use all or every, because everyone can point to, you can always point to an exception. But here, Watts got it right. He used the word all, and he meant all. That all human beings will be swept away, and our lives will be forgotten as we forget our dreams when we wake up. You know, I've heard the illustration in a room of there was I think Ravi Zacharias actually was talking to a group of athletes who are well known, you say by human standards. They're very well known. They've made a name for themselves. And he asked the guys in the locker room, he said, "How many of you in this room can name some of your great-grandparents?" Guys looked around. They said, no one could even name the first names of their great-grandparents. And he said, well, we're just a few generations away from being extinct and forgotten. Say, that's the truth. We all try very hard to make a name for ourselves, to get just the right job and just the right position and keep pushing and striving. And the fact of the matter is, all of us will fly forgotten as a dream at the opening of the day. And so we say, well, why don't we, why aren't we by and large as humans more worried about this? It's quite a drastic diagnosis, isn't it? And the answer we got, I think, most eloquently put by Blaise Pascal, the mathematician. He says, we're very good at diversions. That we do anything we possibly can to actually think about what's just been said in this psalm, that will be swept away and that will be, as Watts said, be forgotten, that our days are numbered. And so Pascal will say things like this, and I think it's true. He says, nothing is so insufferable to human beings as to be completely at rest, without passions, without busyness, without diversion, without study. He then feels his nothingness, his forlornness, his insufficiency, his dependence, his weakness, his emptiness. There will immediately arise from the depth of his heart weariness, gloom, sadness, fretfulness, vexation, despair. So you see what Pascal's saying. We'll do anything to think about what's actually true. That we've got all kinds of passions, we can study, we can think, we can do all, just as long as we don't have to think about, be at rest and say, who am I and who's God? And this, I think, this written some 400 years ago, say it's really been heightened in recent times with things like, smartphones. You just watch around. If you're the kind of person that's a people watcher, I'll just be in the supermarket. The line will be a little bit longer, maybe three people ahead of you in line. You think most people would just kind of wait and think, or if you're a Christian, you might pray. That's not usually what I see. Usually the computer comes out of the pocket, which is what it is, or it's not a phone, a computer, and you're checking baseball scores. See, anything to pause and actually think about life and about who we are, that we're very, very good at diverting our attention from our emptiness and our frailty and our weakness. And Moses in Psalm 90 says, let's not lose sight of what it means to be human. And what it means to be human is to be weak and transitory. How much different than hundreds of years ago have you been to old churches? I remember my grandmother's from a little town on the Ohio River called Wellsville. That's where she grew up, but not really in Wellsville, but in the outskirts. And once a year we'd go down to see the old church down in those parts. And in order to get to the church, you pass through the graveyard. And when you walk through the graveyard, you see the tombstones of all your forebears, right? And you think about how strategic that was. You go to the old world, every church has a graveyard. And in order to get into the church, you pass through the graveyard. You think about the message that's sending. You say, well, I remember him. I remember when we were singing worship songs with him, and I remember her when she served in Sunday school, and now all the people you once knew in your village, in your parish, were underground. So you're going into the church to hear about God and Him being eternal, and walking out of the church being mindful that you too one day will be underground. There's a lady I was talking to, I guess about a year ago now, and she was a widow. And she's going to be buried with her husband, in one grave as they do. And she said, my husband, I went to see the tombstone, and his dates were there. And she said, my name was on the tombstone as well, but it just didn't have the final date. But my name was there. It's inevitable. And Psalm 90 is bringing us to that truth. There's no diversion. Well, there is diversion, but we have to know that that's deceptive. And what this means then again is that we face the reality of our weakness. And the brute fact remains, verse 10 I find remarkable. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength, 80. So that line is 3,500 years old. Think, what about all of our medicine and our computers and all the smart minds, and we've worked so hard, maybe just live a little bit longer. You say, what do you think the life expectancy is in North America? 78 years. You say, going up? No, actually going down. Because of some of the hardships in rural America, that our life expectancy here in the last couple of years has actually went down. I think 3,500 years of human, that is earthly wisdom, has moved the tick on the life expectancy not much at all. You're saying, well, maybe if you eat a bit more kale and less, fewer donuts, maybe push it up towards the Japanese, maybe get 82 or 83 years. You get the point. In the scheme of all this, 70 or 80 years is what we have. And then we return, verse 3, we return to the dust. I think that's both a metaphor, that we go into the ground, but also literal, that after a while, how we know each other in these bodies will be return to actual dust. And how about then verses 5 and 6, like a blade of withering grass is our lives. You know that, and we've had a little, I think, a wetter than usual summer, but you know the kinds of summers that we can have where the grass is kind of crunchy under your feet. You get a morning dew, and maybe in the spring it's looking good, and then, you get a couple of days of sun, and that grass is withered. And what Moses is saying is this is what it means to be human. All of us. We're weak, we're frail, 70 or 80 years, we go back to the dust, we fade like the grass. Are there any exceptions? There are no exceptions. Lots of illustrations for this sermon. Just in February, I think many of us watched, Billy Graham's funeral and paid attention to that. He's one of my great heroes. And watching him, you go back and watch sermons from the 50s, and you see this kind of tall and handsome, vibrant guy. His hair's flowing. He's preaching to these massive crowds. He's full of energy. You look then at the end of his life. White hair, frail, hunched over, unable to do public appearances because his mind wasn't lucid enough to. You think, wow, even the great Billy Graham, like a blade of grass, right? And he had 99 years. So I think we get this truth, right? That we're weak and we're frail. We're told not to think about it, but that's true. That's who we are. As I say, then it actually gets worse. Notice verse 10. So the weakness and the frailty is matched with this line, that the span of our years, no matter how long we have, are marked by toil and trouble. I never get tired of saying, because it's been true, say even if you have a really good life, you have appliances in your home, you've got friends, you have an education, you've got a good social network, you have all those boxes ticked, life's still very sad. And there are things outside of our control that we say, wow, even I've got all this at my disposal, and I'm still find myself feeling disappointed and empty. How can that be in the modern world? Look at the referendum on the modern world with things like depression rates and anxiety rates. You say we're at all-time highs. Is that communicating this message, right? All of our days, our best achievements are toil and trouble. The writer Tennessee Williams, I like his plays, arguably the greatest of the 20th century American playwrights. He had a very difficult childhood, Tennessee Williams. So you might know plays like Streetcar Named Desire or Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, so a major playwright. But Tennessee Williams was an obscure figure, and he penned a play called The Glass Menagerie, and it was to premiere in Chicago in 1944. And it's one of those stories where overnight Tennessee Williams went from somebody nobody knew to being catapulted into the public eye. I mean, he went from a nobody to being very, very famous in a short period of time. And 3 years after The Glass Menagerie made Tennessee Williams famous, he wrote a little essay that appeared in the New York Times, and the title of it will say a lot. The Catastrophe of Success. And it's well worth reading, that all of his fame, everything that he'd strived for, led really to a very sorrowful place. And I think Williams, he tells a lot of stories in there, but he says, one night in this kind of a drunken party where he had all of his buddies over, and some of them went out into his complex, and they made a mess and vomited. The next morning he gets up hungover, and he sees a very poor old woman cleaning up the mess of his drunken friends the night before, and he says, what have I done? The very thing that I've strived for, the very thing that I wanted to be a famous playwright has actually destroyed me and made me feel empty. And the last lines of this essay, again, you can read the whole thing. Just the last lines are these. The time is short, and it doesn't return again. It's slipping away while I write this and while you read it. And the monosyllable of the clock is loss, loss, loss. So that's one of our most famous people in the last 100 years. What's William saying? He's saying, look, I've done everything. I've strived to do this, and I feel empty, and the clock is moving in one direction. What chance do I have? And so we ask ourselves, what do we do? Fretting about, that promotion at work, or being somebody we're not, or wishing we were a bit, more well-known, or a bit more proficient in an area, and we can spend so much time preoccupied in that area. And what is Moses saying? Say, all of our days really are toil and trouble. And let's make sure whatever we're striving for is actually within the right perspective. Think of that story in Luke 12. There, I have it cited in your notes. It's one of my favorites. It's the guy who says, I'm wealthier now, and I'm getting more stuff, and my current barns don't hold all my stuff, and I think that I'm going to tear down my small barns and build bigger barns to house all the stuff that I have. And what does God say? Buddy, you don't need those bigger barns, because today's your day. You're going to die today. I think that's such a powerful story. Working so hard here on this one little thing, upset about this thing. Wait, what's the big picture? The big picture is that even my best achievements on this earth will be trouble and sorrow. Let's take it a step further then. You couldn't have missed how much this psalm talks about God's anger and God's wrath. That human beings were under God's wrath, right? For we're brought to an end by your anger, by your wrath we are dismayed. Verse 7, our iniquities are before you, God. All of our days pass away under our wrath. And we have to ask ourselves, why is this psalm then talking so much about God's wrath? And again, we say we don't want to think about that. We say we don't want to think about God being angry at all of us. But now here's the truth. This is very important for all of us to understand in 2018, that God necessarily needs to be angry and wrathful against human sinfulness. So all of us, we can think about, the things that we've done in our lives. Sometimes people know about those things. Other things we know about, but other people don't know. And we say, yes, God's perfect. We know His standard. And one thing we should all agree on, say none of us are perfect, that we've all fallen short of God's glory and His perfection. And so we need to say, if God is the arbiter, if He's the just judge of what's right and what's wrong, that really morality meets in Him, He's the one who defines that, and we're saying all of us have done wrong as God defines it, then what other response can God have to be angry at human sin and human iniquity? In other words, God's anger and His wrath is just the other side of His love and justice. In order to be a just judge, He needs to be angry at human wrongdoing. And Moses gets this right. Remember, he's wandering around the desert. God's given the Israelites the things that He wants them to do. They deliberately disobey God, and He's angry, and Moses knows it. Here we are, God. We have no home. We're wandering around in the desert. We've disobeyed you. Your wrath is upon us. The things that we're trying to do are not really adding up, and so it goes. And I think that this really hits it at the heart of why anyone would ever become a Christian. To me, the seriousness of human rebellion is the kind of linchpin as to why in the world would anyone turn to a Savior? That is what Jesus did on the cross, unless we thought we were sinful and needed saving. That hopefully anyone who's a Christian in the room says, yes, I needed to be saved by Jesus, that God's wrath was upon me, and the only answer to that is the mediating blood of the Lord Jesus. The seriousness of sin really unlocks the whole redemption equation. So Martin Luther, you got the quote there, Luther, the reformer, there's a lot on Luther with Psalm 90, that Luther trembled when reading this psalm. He was absolutely terrified. He says many times, I just have one line, he said, it often happened to me when I was a monk. So in other words, before the Reformation, but he was a Christian, he was an Augustinian monk. When he was a monk, when reading Psalm 90, I had to lay it aside. See, Luther was so fearful, he's reading this. What made Luther such a great theologian is that he got it. He understood the magnitude of what's at stake, that all of us need a Savior, that we need help. God's wrath is upon us. Our days are short. Who can help us? Who can get us out of this meaningless, frail existence? Now, thanks be to God. At this point, you say we should all be converted to existentialism, right? That this is a dark picture. But thanks be to God, now we can look at the other side of the contrast. That's what it means to be human. Sinful, transitory, struggling, despairing, limited time, whole other host of words you could use. That's the one side of the contrast. Now, gloriously, the other side of the contrast is the person and character of God. That this psalm gives us a lot on the character, the attributes of what it means to be God and ultimately say, yes, that is where we, as these lowly human beings, are going to find our meaning and our permanence, not in us kind of floating around down here trying to make a name for ourselves, but actually serving the God of the universe. So notice verse 2. So before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you, that's God, had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. So unlike weak human beings, God is permanent and powerful. So he's far older than the things that we think are very old. So mountains are what are mentioned here. You've all been to the national parks, right? You've seen those diagrams, the tectonic plates. If you're into geology, the tectonic plates are moving and they collide and they push up the Alps or something like that. And it happened however many millions of years ago it did. And you think, that's very old. That was a long time ago that this mountain was formed. Psalm 90 says, well, yeah, it's a long time not for God. For God, that was, he did that. He remembers the forming of that mountain as if it's now. That's how big and vast he is. So even the oldest things that human beings can come up with are very new to God. This is a classic verse on the eternity of God, that there was no time when God didn't exist. You see, time and matter are inventions of God, right? He imposed those things on us. When he created matter, he also created time. So we think whatever we think as being a very long time ago is as now to God. From everlasting to everlasting, he is God. There's no beginning, there's no end. That's who he is, unlike us. 70 or 80 years, meaningless work, things outside of our control. How unlike that is God. From everlasting to everlasting, he's God. And then you get the great line in verse 4, don't we? For 1,000 years in God's sight is like yesterday, or 1,000 years, rather, is like a watch in the night. So if you know the way Hebrew poetry works, in English we have things like rhyme and meter. In Hebrew poetry, like the Psalms are, that you have a line repeated once and then the second line actually amplifies what is said before. So it's kind of building on what's said before. So what the psalmist is saying here, 1,000 years for God is like yesterday. It's like a 24-hour period. Actually, that's not going far enough. Actually, 1,000 years for you, God, is like a few hours in the night. There were 4 watches in the night. So something like 3 to 4 hours, 1,000 years. So even though it's a word picture, you think about think of 1,000 years ago. So something 1,000 years, like the Crusades. You're in the medieval times. There's been a lot of human history in that span. A lot of epochs, you got Renaissance history and early modern history, a lot of famous thinkers, a lot of wars. What Moses is saying is all that time period, all that complexity, all that stuff for God is like 2 or 3 hours. See, how much different is God in this matter, right? How big and how large and how vast and how understanding is he of our predicament? And we can take this in all kinds of directions. I just have one in notes, but think about the modern division in the evangelical church about something like the age of the earth, which is a big issue, right? The origins debate. And whether the rock of the earth is relatively old or relatively new. People get really say, what do you think Psalm 90 verse 2 would say to that end? Say, it really doesn't matter if the rock of the earth, what age it is. The point is it's very new to God. And he's in control, and he did it, and that is not the way we are. So he's powerful. He spoke things into existence. He's eternal. He's immense, right? He's everywhere. As verse 8 says, he knows, even a great irony here, he knows our secret sins. See, a great irony. See, there's no such thing as a secret sin before God. There's secret sins between one another in any room where there's more than one person, right? There's secret sins for sure. But all is laid bare before God. As a pastor told me when I was just starting off preaching, he was closing in on 80. He had preached many, many decades. And he said, young man, you remember this, your time in ministry, that truth and time walk hand in hand. That whatever is in your life will ultimately be exposed, if not in this life, then certainly in the life to come in the person of God. And that's what Moses is saying here. God, you've set all of our iniquities before you. Our secret sins are in the light of your presence. A great message of Jonah. Maybe if I change locations, God won't know about it. Maybe if I work really hard to keep everyone else from knowing who I am, he won't know about it. No, Moses is saying, God, we're not fooling you. You're everywhere. You know, and as Joel said, the great thing about God's love for us is that he loves us despite knowing these things. That's the eternal home that we talk about. So even our secret sins are known before God. He knows all things. Then verse 17. What then would we say? How do we manage before God, given our predicament and his? And we get this twice repeated line in verse 17, that God can establish the work of our hands. Establish the work of our hands. Say, what does that mean? Why does he repeat it twice? And I think it means this, that no matter what we do this week, that our jobs, the people that we relate with, that if we're just doing it to please other people, or we're just doing it for a paycheck, that's going to we're going to feel empty and really a loss, and there'll be trouble and sorrow. However, if we have the perspective that all that we do is for God and unto his glory, that he's going to give purpose and meaning to what we think is mundane activity. That's what it means, that he will establish the work of our hands. And this is what I think so many miss, that only in the person of God, the permanency of God, the only thing that's able to transcend what it means to be human and kind of getting on with the day-to-day routines, the only thing that can pull us out of that sphere is that there's a great purpose in serving God. Did you see this in the news this week? You've undoubtedly seen the young man, 29. So he's a young guy, a lot younger than me. He took that plane, right? And he crashed the plane. And we said, "What's with this guy? He's got a family and everything." And one of the last lines he spoke is that I'm a very lost person. And you think, well, I think we in one level, we all should be lost if this is all there is, right? If the human side of it is all there is, the first part of what we talked about, is that all there is, then yeah, we probably should be depressed. But how glorious to say there's a God who we can find our permanent home, and no matter what's happening on this fallen earth, that we can put our trust in him and what he did through Jesus on the completed work of the cross, right? The finished work on the cross. That Jesus' perfect life for ours, as we identify in Jesus that our lives have all kinds of purpose, even in the routines of life. That God alone can give meaning to our daily activity, is what Moses is saying. He can establish the work of our hands. So what's the response today, kind of the takeaway? I hope we see in this contrast, we see who we are and we see who God is. And we come to a greater realization that tucking into God and serving him is really the most fulfillment that we're going to experience for the short time that we have. We get the great phrase where the title of the message comes from, teach us, God, to number our days. It's a great little phrase. Each day is a gift from him. No one in the room can live a moment longer than what God has ordained. God, help me today to serve you, to be wise, not to be foolish and serve myself, because if I serve myself, I'm going to feel empty. That's not the way to go. I want to serve you because you're permanent and I'm just in transition. This is not my home. God is our home. Or think of the way Paul says it. You might be thinking of this verse. I wouldn't be surprised if Paul was thinking of Psalm 90 when he wrote this. He said, look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of time, for the days are evil. The best use of time is not serving ourselves. The best use of time is serving the only one who's everlasting, the only one whose opinion counts, the only one who's the rightful judge, the only one who sees all things. He's the one that we should serve. So may we serve him. May we number our days. May we live as those who are wise. Let's pray. Father, thank you for Psalm 90. And while we talked about some things here now that are very scary, and we are frail and we're weak, and we acknowledge today that we need your help. And Lord, many in the room today say, I'm in that position where I've just been doing my own thing, where I've just been kind of floating out, trying to serve myself and my own needs, and I'm not finding meaning, and the more I serve myself, the more empty I feel. And I hope today we're able to see the other side, to say, in the everlasting God, you're our dwelling place, you're our home, you're where we belong. And so, Lord, yes, may we use every day not to serve ourselves, but to serve you. May Christ be lifted high in his name. Amen.